Well, assalamu alaikum. Thank you for having me. It's a great honor to be here. My thanks to the team, for Fuad and for Munir and Jihad and everyone. And I look forward to a good debate, much like yesterday, and discussion. I have a lot to say, and this is why you can see me scrambling, but this is sort of what I end up doing always. I feel like it's very clear in my head what I want to say, but then it's a whole book in my head, so it becomes somewhat difficult for me over the course of ruminations about what I'm going to say, what I actually will end up presenting in an ordered fashion. So, but I hope I have given some order to what I'm going to do here. And I want to make some preliminary remarks. So the book, this is basically a small section of a chapter from the book, which pertains to our topic. Jihad and I were having a discussion about metaphysics and logic. And one of the things that interests me, that I hinted at yesterday, is how it is that the internal dialectics of the tradition, any tradition itself, perpetuates certain motions, certain dynamism, changes, transformations. And those kinds of motions can sometimes, even when they are in the field of formal logic, be determined by commitments to ontology or even theology. I understand philosophy and theology as part of this larger dialectic, which is diachronic, goes over centuries. Sometimes authors shift all the way to the past, sometimes they move forward. Sometimes their motions are curated by certain texts that precede them, that beckon them towards that motion, and sometimes they respond to that by incorporating their own interests in their own motion, in their own moment, into those responses. Right. So it's basically one of the things I talk about in this book is a theory of this dialectic that is found in the Shuruh and Hawashi. And so you will see in this talk, even though it's really about logic and about metaphysics and theology, you will see me, because of one of my main commitments in that book, talk about how commentaries work, right? So I'm not just going to tell you that author so-and-so said this thing and the other author said this thing. I'm going to try to show you how the commentaries and the logic of commentarial life perpetuated certain kinds of outcomes in the field of logic. And I'm going to try to ground those outcomes in formal logic in certain concerns that Muslims had as metaphysicians and theologians. That's the main point. The text I'm going to use, which is the main focus of the book as a case study, is a work called the Sullam al-Ulum, the Ladder of the Sciences, of an author called Muhibballah Al-Bihārī. He is an Indian author who writes in Arabic and in Persian. That's mine. All right. Who writes in Arabic and in Persian. He is a rather important figure in the court, in the Mughal court. And he was appointed at various administrative posts as well, was in Kabul at one point. In addition to the Sulam al-Ulum, he has some rasail on various matters related to logic and metaphysics. And he has a famous book that I'm sure a good number of you know, called the Musallam al-Thubut, which is an usul al-fiqh work, considered in South Asia to be, like his Sulam, which is a logic work, to be the most advanced Hanafi usul work. And it has, a famous commentary by Bahr al-Ulum Abdul Ali, Bahr al-Ulum, called Fawati' ar-Rahamut. So, so he's a pretty important author, and his Sulam al-Ulum is, for me, a case study because it's a mutton that generated something close to, in fact, a little bit above, depending on how you count, 100 commentaries in the course of about 200 years, right? So you can do the math. It's a commentary every 2 years. And it started, the commentarial practice started already within his lifetime. He himself wrote a self-commentary on it. Much like, for example, Nasafi talks about his self-commentary on his Matn on the Usul, which he is a mukhtasar of previous authors. So the Sulam is in many ways something, it looks like something like a mukhtasar of logic works, although it has its own commitments, its own structure, and its own formal aspects of progressing. Now the book is concerned not just with the ideas in the Sulam. In the book I give full translation and a very extended commentary explaining the text itself. But that's only one of the concerns. I'm concerned, of course, with what's happening to the field of logic and the embedded metaphysics and ontology in the book. But the other concern of mine is because I want to talk about this whole question of dynamism in the Islamic tradition and the problems and assumptions that underlie the very question of dynamism. Assumptions about authorship, originality, modes of production, and so on. A good part of the book is concerned with a theory of commentaries. How do we get into the commentaries? How do we read them? In this case, I read commentaries over 10 years on this text and probably engaged all 100 of them at one point or another. So you begin to get a sense of how these authors think about their place in the commentarial life. How do they think of themselves as authors? Are they original authors, and what does originality mean in that context? How do they embed earlier texts? Under what provocation do they do so? Do they use earlier texts in their own voice without attribution? And do they use earlier texts, for example, to comment on a later text? Right. One of the points that I end up realizing in my study of commentaries, and I keep pushing throughout the book, is that you have to think of any matan, which may be, for example, a first text, or even a commentary, or even a commentary on a commentary. Any matan that is worth its salt, that's going to perpetuate itself and is going to have an influence, is going to provoke a writing upon itself. It's filled with these prompts and allusions, and it curates the motion of future texts. It beckons them forward, right? So there are lots of moments in the Sullam, which is a very pithy text, very elusive and very elusive. It's very hard to read. One-liners are embedded with the whole history of an argument that the reader kind of knows. And the matin sort of would give you a position, and sometimes give you a very brief argument. Sometimes even that argument in support of his claim would be a problematic argument, and he knows that it is problematic. And he would end by saying fatadabbar. Now, normally we translate that as reflect on it and you're done, right? The tadabbar comment is often taken, or fihi nazar, for example, is taken by the commentator as a prompt, as a curated prompt, forcing him through the hints within the matan itself to go to other parts of the text, or other texts that relate to that moment, or to the prehistory of the matan's writing of the matan. In other words, it's sort of a curated event that runs chronologically. When the commentator explains or critiques the matan, he himself would end in the same fashion. He would say something like وَفِيهِ إِشَارَةٌ or فَتَدَبَّرْ فَتَأَمَّلْ, and so on. And those cues are very important to reflect on, because the matin, in this case the sharih himself, is operating like a matin. His text, of course, does something as a hierophant for the oracle, which is the matan, but he himself then becomes an oracle for the future text. So in many ways, the way to think about this cycle of mutun and shuruh and hawashi is to think of basically one long authorial engagement. The matin is sort of presenting his inner word, sort of a silent, ishara. And he is perpetuating the life of his text by, beckoning, forcing, curating the future matin to speak what he wanted to speak. Sometimes giving a bad argument in support of his claim, so that the sharih, knowing what the bad argument is, going to his self-commentary or to some other part of the text to which he's sort of pointing, would fill out the space, do the work that the matin is supposed to do. And then the sharih would perpetuate his text in the same fashion by pointing. So, so it's a different kind of authorship, right? I wouldn't call it shared authorship. I wouldn't call it collective authorship. It's something like, I have epigraphs in the book. It's something, as Pascal would say, that this is, one human being learning in the course of its long, long history, right? So it's a different kind of temporality that's involved here. So that's one of the things I talk about in this book, and of course, because that's how I engage the technical material, that will come out in this talk. Now, a couple of other things before we get into the meat and the substance of all of this, because I know that you guys are interested in the hard, sort of logic and metaphysics of all of this, as Jihad and I were talking on our Zoom conversation. Just to lay out some things, you're going to get quotes in this stuff that I'm projecting here from the matin, who is Al-Bihārī, and some of the earliest first-order commentaries. By first-order commentaries, I mean the first layer. And of course, there are second-order commentaries, like a commentary on the book, and then there are fourth and so on, right? The earliest commentary I'm going to engage is somebody called Mubaraki, Muhammad al-Mubaraki, and then there's Sa'inpuri and Firuz, Alhamdulillah, Mubin, and then there's a marginal note on Alhamdulillah. Those are the texts I'm going to present to you as we go forward as we dive into the technical matters. Is everybody okay as a preliminary set of comments? Okay. Great. It's really an amazing, by the way, I should really say, just finish with a talk, the most exciting part for me in writing this book has been to think about the theory of commentaries. It's a sort of an internal theory of how the Muslim tradition in a genre of writing that is the most important genre in the post-classical period, how is it thinking about the progress of its ideas? And the logic of how commentarial work is done really explains a lot, and even sort of makes us rethink basic questions when we say the tradition is or is not dynamic. Well, there's a different standard of perpetuating knowledge through which those questions even have to be asked. The assumptions that are Eurocentric have to be dropped. So I hope that people benefit from it, and of course I hope I get constructive critique so I can keep modifying my ideas in the course of my life. Okay, let's get to the hard stuff now. So I'm interested. How should I begin? I'm interested in propositional semantics. For example, when you make a claim that every x is y, what are the assumptions from a logical point of view that have to be granted for that claim to be true, for the claim to be valid, or even for that claim to make sense? As our colleague yesterday was pointing out, in formal logic, the subject terms of a proposition need to refer to something, right? So you guys remember that in the symbolic notation that he presented with quantifiers, right? When you say, every x has a property of being f, there has to be some x underlying the expression, which is a referent of that tag, and it is that referent, that thing being referred to by the tag that has the attribute of being f. Now, what underlies that tag could be a number of things, right? It could be something in your head, for example, something in your mind. It could be this table outside, it could be an idea, and so on and so forth. There has to be some kind of a tag, some kind of an object underlying the tag. Now, this is a basic position that Aristotle has, this is a basic position that Avicenna has, and this is effectively, in many ways, a basic position that late logic in the European tradition also has. This is why, by the way, as I was pointing out yesterday, when you look at Carnap's critique of Heidegger, because Heidegger has statements like nothing is X, Y, and Z, right? And of course, he ends up, by the way, writing poetry. I don't know if you guys have read Heidegger's poetry, because to convey his thoughts in symbolic logic in an easy fashion or a straightforward fashion is not easy. So Carnap's logical syntax book, very short book, is effectively a critique of Heidegger, saying that Heidegger is talking nonsense. You cannot represent his ordinary language claims in formal logic, because you cannot, in many cases, you don't have a referent underlying his subject tag, right? That's one of the problems that he has with it. That aside, whether we agree with that or not, this is a basic position also that formal logic has in Islam. So here are a couple of basic principles that start off the story. What you're going to end up seeing is that basic assumption about how the semantics of propositions work will lead you, or will force you to have to reject basic claims. And so the Muslims, some of these claims are theological. So in order to overcome that problem, that conundrum, sorry, make it larger? Sure. In order to overcome that conundrum, the Muslim tradition turned to its ontology and metaphysics and modified some elements of the semantics of propositions. That's really what I want to engage here, right? Okay, principle number 1 of propositional semantics. This is from Bihārī Sulam al-Ulūm. He says the following: in the proposition, every J is A. By J, we do not mean that whose reality is J, nor do we mean that which is described by it. Rather, we mean something more general than these two senses. We mean those individual instances of which J is true. These individual instances may be real, such as the particular instances, or species instances, right? So when I say every J is A, what underlies the J may be a real instance, such as this table, or it may be table as a species, right? So it has to be both. Or, that's one thing, it could be one, or there may be instances that are product of mental consideration, such as animal genus. So animal, insofar as you take it as a genus, that actually does not exist as a table out there, nor is it a real kind. It's something that is a product of your mental consideration. Insofar as you take man as a genus, or animal as a genus of man, that is a certain mental concoction, or a certain mental production or consideration, which could also be the underlying element of a subject tag, right? So he's saying that those are the possibilities. For the latter is more specific than animal simpliciter, right? By that he means animal as a kind is more specific than animal insofar as animal is a genus. Okay, however, then he just ends by saying, however, customary usage takes only the first type noted above as relevant. So when we use ordinary language, we really mean the first type, we don't mean animal as genus. But of course, he can accommodate both. So everybody's okay with this basic principle? Okay, so we need something underlying the tag. That's the basic point, if you're going to make any claim of this sort, that every J is A. Okay, here's a second principle of propositional semantics that's going to show up. That's item number 2. In the case of predication, the subject must be on at least the same ontological plane as the predicate. So thus, when you say every j is A, j must be at least as real as A, right? So if you say, for example, I don't know, the Golden Mountain is big, and if by the bigness your claim is that it's an extramental reality, extramental predicate that's being applied to the Golden Mountain must also be at least as extramentally real as your predicate. So you cannot, for example, invent a Golden Mountain in your mind and say that the predicate extramentally applies to this mental concoction. So they have to be on the same ontological plane.
So yes? Getting them in the same space is a matter of the considerations behind your subject and predicate. I mean this from this perspective.
Exactly. So that has to be clear. You can say, for example, imagine there are no triangles in the world, right? You can say every triangle is a figure. As long as by that predication figure, you don't mean triangles, that exist in the real world have 180 degrees, for example, right? Because there is no such triangle in that situation other than one in your mind. So they have to be on the same level at least. Now, of course, the subject may be more real than the predicate. You can say, for example, that the notion of 180 degrees applies to triangles out in the real world. That's fine, right? But the triangles better be as real on the same ontological or greater ontological plane as the predicate, right? So those are two basic principles on which your semantics are going to operate. The problems are going to be the following. When you say every square circle is impossible, I imagine that you guys take this to be a real claim, right? But there are no such things as square circles. I don't even know if they're in your mind. It might be just a tag. I mean, I don't know if you guys can think of square circles. You can't really concept. You can give a definition. Yeah, right. But when you say it's not possible, exactly. So when you say it's not possible, I think you mean that in a real sense, right?
I don't think it's actually conceptually possible.
Okay, so that
like
means
a griffin or a chimera.
Mm-hmm.
We can conceive of such a thing, right? But
Good.
it's conceptually.
Planting will probably say it's possible, but there's no instantiation of a square circle in any possible world.
Exactly.
But it's indeterminate.
Right. So when you're saying, if you're making a predicative claim that it is impossible, which I imagine, given what you have said, would be a true claim, what is that predicate applying to? Given the rules I've given of principle number 1 and principle number 2.
Which predicate?
Impossibility. When you say the square circle is impossible, it seems to be a pretty good real claim. But given the semantics I've just offered, there better be something underlying the square circle for this claim to have any meaning, right? But somehow we take this claim to be true. So there's a problem now that needs to be resolved.
So, if I'm understanding you correctly, I'm conceiving that I cannot conceive, right? So it's on the same plane as far as my impossibility. It's not that it's impossible that it is reified. It's impossible to conceive of something that is still a mental concept.
But what is the impossibility claim applying to? If it's applying to the fact that you cannot conceive of a square circle, then you have some kind of a conception to which it's applying. Even the conception that it cannot be conceptualized is some conception, right? So it must, again, it's on the same ontological plane, in this case on a mental ontological plane. If you mean by that something...
Or the impossibility applying to the squared circle. Is that the difference that you're making?
The other one would be the harder, impossibility, the one we sort of take to be true in ordinary language. When you say the square circle is impossible, what you mean by that is neither in my mind nor in the extra-mental world is it possible to have a square circle, but what is this thing about which you're making the claim? According to you, it's impossible, right? So I think
The ontological parity.
It keeps going away.
So how is that circumscribed again? The ontological parity between the subject and predicate on what's Bihārī saying?
We're not yet to what Bihārī is going to say.
As you've explicated it now, what do you mean by the ontological parity between subject and predicate? Where can there be differentiation?
So the problem here is that the square circle would either be a mental consideration or an extramental, mind independent. It's neither,
That's
right?
That's true, yeah.
So the predicate impossible has to apply on at least one of those two planes.
Right, so it has to be for the parity to be there.
There has to be some kind of parity. Now, at the same time, even though I think you're recognizing we're having a problem with this, it seems that on some level we think this is a true claim. It's not a nonsensical claim.
Meaningful.
It's a meaningful claim. So it's not parsing with the two principles I've given. Yes?
Yeah, I was just going to say that the problem here, and I know Bihārī, he has his solutions to this problem, but at this point, we are, if we take the first two principles that you've mentioned, and we concede to those first two principles, then square circle must have a reference, something. But yet, we're saying it doesn't when we say impossible, and so hence.
It has to hook onto something to tag, otherwise what are you putting on?
Exactly. So everybody see the problem, right? Now this problem, and there are other examples. You can, and the Bihārī also has, yes, please, yeah.
Just for sake of clarity. So on one level, that proposition holds as long as they're in the mental plane. But you're saying that there's some inkling that this impossibility also projects onto the external or real world. And that's where the problem is according to the problem.
It's actually holding on neither plane. You're right. What we want is really, when you say square circle is impossible, you're really talking about the world independent of your mind even, right? But even in your mind, there is no square circle. So even on that sort of, mind-dependent plane, this proposition should not be true. There's nothing it's hooking onto.
Right. So we're saying square circle is either mental or mind-independent, and it's neither.
It's neither.
Okay.
But this claim seems to be true.
This claim seems to be true.
Right? Good. This is fun stuff. Okay. And I'm glad for the engagement. I hope I can get through it. So if I don't get to the end, I hope you don't, hold it against me. As long as we're having this dialectic, that's the important part, right?
So,
yes.
Forgive me for being the slowest student in the room. In the case of number 3, every square circle is impossible. We've actually achieved the conditions because squared circle isn't an impossibility, is also not.
It's not an impossibility because if there is a referent under it, then it is possible already, right? Either mentally or extramentally. So it's yeah. Are we okay? I don't expect a solution right now, and I don't know if there is an easy one. But if we're sufficiently bothered by it, that's all I wanted to do. Right? You can also, for example, do other things. So Bihārī actually has a pretty capacious sense of what the mind can do. He has a claim that the mind can conceptualize anything, right? Under certain conditions and hypotheticals and so on and so forth. So you can say, okay, there is really no such thing as a number 2 that is odd, but let me just posit that, right? It's even nonsensical. But I can say if there were a number 2 that is odd, then that would be a number, right? So you can make, again, the same kind of problem. There's nothing underlying the number 2, but if you on some level, under some hypotheses and so on, are able to posit a number 2 that is odd by a mental claim, then if that claim is true, then that would be a number, right? But again, we see that this seems to be a true statement, but it's clearly a problematic statement, right? Because there's nothing that on which it can be hooked, right?
We have similar Quranic examples, like if there were 2 deities, so you supposit, right? So you can have textual examples.
Yep.
I mean, I think Razi talks about that and others,
Unless we can see that the grammar is suggesting the impossibility.
That's right.
Now it gets theological, right? So within the same format, Sharik al-Bari mumtane, this is a famous example, right? The participant or equal, however you want to translate Sharik, the Sharik al-Bari is mumtane, the participant with the creator is impossible. Now again, we take this, if you follow the ontological proofs of the existence of God and the unity and unicity of God and so on, and the uniqueness of God in various traditions in the Islamic one, and take them to be demonstrative proofs, then you've already shown that there is no such thing per se as a participant or equal of God, right? Assuming those demonstrations are true. If that's the case, then this statement equally should be nonsensical, because there is nothing underlying the part, neither in your mind, because it's a per se impossibility, it's a logical impossibility according to the proofs that have been given. So you can't say this either, but this seems to be a pretty important claim for Muslims, right? So it's in the same family of problems. So these are, and finally, as we'll see later on, this is an allied problem. When I say, for example, Zayd exists or God exists, I'm assuming that there is some underlying thing under Zayd or God, which is the hook, mental or extramental, and I'm claiming a certain predicate of this thing. In this case, the existential predicate that it exists is supposed to be something that comes to inhere in the subject term, right? But if it comes to inhere in Zayd, and therefore granting him existence, Zayd must already exist on some, some higher level of existence. And that level of existence, if it allows for me to claim, make an existential claim about that, let's say mental Zayd, then I would have the same regress. That one must exist, right? So this is violating, this seems to be a very good claim. Zayd exists, God exists, we say it all the time, but it seems to be violating principle number 2, right? We have to grant the existence of Zayd on some level, but if the existence of Zayd is something Zaid, right, is something that comes to supervene on him, then the claim Zayd exists must have a priority of an existing Zayd before existence comes to inhere in him, right? So again, it seems to be basic claim, seems to be violating a basic principle of semantics, right? So these are the problems that we're confronted with in this text, and as you can see, they're tied to ontology as well. So at this point, I think things, of course, will get dicier from this point on. But I think what I'll do now, and I imagine you guys didn't have the chance to read that part of the book that I sent, but I'll slowly read some parts and I'll go over quotes with you, and then we'll sort of reflect. And we can stop any time, right? I don't know if we'll get to the
question.
yeah.
Could another way to say what it is that you posited here is how are we grounding that which is logically impossible?
Yeah, that's exactly it. How do we ground something that seems to be, that is logically impossible, but seems to be a true claim, right? Okay.
Can I just
Yeah.
ask for a clarification on statement number 5? Is he positing that as a logical impossibility, or is that sort of like a customary impossibility? Similar to what Seth brought up in terms of, there was a debate among theologians when they talked about the statement, if there were 2 gods, then or if there were many gods, that the world would be corrupt. And in some, I think it was Teftazani and other logicians said, this is not a logical impossibility. We can conceive of 2 gods, and they may cooperate and work together, that the world, but it's a customary impossibility.
Yeah. So.
And so I'm just curious, what number 5 was a logical impossibility for Bihārī, or is it a sort of what we would call a customary?
No, this would be a logical impossibility because the participant with the creator is presumably shown to be impossible through demonstration, necessary demonstrations in the metaphysics works. So if you follow those demonstrations and you believe them, you're convinced by them, then you would hold it as a necessity that there cannot be a God, as a per se necessity.
So
Metaphysically impossible, right? And if
the very concept of God negation is possible.
exactly, the mere concept of a participant of God would be denied in these demonstrations. So once you've done that work, then you find yourself in the same this is the same family of problem, right? It's like a square circle at that point.
Just a quick clarification, sorry to this, I know.
Yeah, no, please, yeah.
Point. So when we're saying the subject predicate construct there, that syntactical construct, is the assumption that every time we say, let's say A is F, or in this case J is A, every J is A, are we assuming that whenever we make such claims, or that we have an ontological commitment when we utter those words, that we're committing, we're not just asserting, but we're committing, making an ontological commitment? Is that the background assumption?
There has to be, exactly, there has to be some kind of ontological commitment, right? Precisely, I think, for reasons that were being hinted at yesterday. Exactly, there has to be some ontology underlying it. And the problem precisely is that the ontology of this thing should allow me to make this claim, given the demonstrations, seems therefore to be a true claim, but logically it's a nonsensical claim, right? So we can't say this in any meaningful way, given what I've just explained. Okay, so I'm going to read a bit at this point, because it's a very convoluted development, and I have to confess that I can't keep it all in my head. It required lots of hundreds of pages of notes and confusions on my part, and ultimately I think I got it. So I can't reproduce it off the top of my head, to be honest. That's why I sent you the book, but I sent it very late. Okay, so in its technical aspects, the example I've chosen, predication, that's what we're really talking about, goes to the very core of the Sulam as an organic text. As such, it is also representative of the broader orientation of the work. Although the Sulam is a complete logic work that maps rather neatly onto the structure of earlier handbooks, the unity of its discursive engine is generated by the conundrums tied to certain types of propositional claims, as I'm pointing out here. That's a leitmotif. It's trying. Oh, you don't have the quotation yet. I'm just reading this, and I'm going to give you the quotation. I'll alert you when we get to the quotation. Yeah. In simple terms, these latter concern predication over supposed objects that have neither mental nor extramental existence, as we have been discussing. So those are the points where, as the logic of textbook develops, is these kinds of conundrums that it sort of invests itself in and tries to resolve them through shukuk, and then sets up the whole engine in motion and so on, right? Yet the claims appear to be valid, thus violating the basic principle of affirmation that the subject term must have existential import of some sort. There's some ontological commitment. Examples include statements such as the participant with the creator is impossible, and even this one, that which is absolutely unknown has no judgment passed of it, right? Al-majhul al-mutlaq la yuhka anhu. That's an interesting statement, right? That which is absolutely unknown cannot have any judgment passed on it, but sir, you just passed a judgment on it, right? But that's a true claim. I cannot pass any judgment on that which is absolutely unknown, but in saying that, I'm already passing a judgment. So it's the same family of problems. Sorry, I couldn't hear you. No. Oh yeah, exactly. The same idea. Absolutely, yes, absolutely. Okay, as I showed in chapter 2, which you guys haven't read, solutions to these types of problems could only be offered on the posit of certain types of mental determinations, and this in turn produced the further tension with the programmatic conviction that logic was a tool of the sciences and was meant to facilitate the discovery of mind-independent reality. So the other tension that occurs in this book is that the solution to these kinds of things that really obsesses the Sulam, right? This is the real crux of the matter. And by the way, I hate to make these kinds of comparisons because I think, again, as I've been pressing, there's an internal logic to traditions. So when you make these comparisons, it just bothers me because now I can compare this to kinds of paradoxes that are being dealt with by Russell and Frege and so on, right? But I always shy from doing so because there is an internal set of assumptions and premises and positions with a long dialogic history that is producing this. But if just for a moment, if I could say it's the same kinds of conundrums that are being dealt with in late 19th and early 20th century philosophy that leads to the development of analytic philosophy. I'll leave that aside, I'll keep moving. Okay, towards the end of the section on quantification and subject terms, Al-Bihārī, or Matin, mentions 4 interconnected investigations that pertain to universal affirmative propositions. Every A is B. The 4th of these, on predication, which is what we're focusing on here, contains several subsections, and I'm going to take up the 2nd of these subsections as my part of departure. In order to situate the nature of the commentarial exercise in what follows, because I'm not just going to give what's happening, but also show you how it's happening in the space of commentaries, I present the matan in full, and this is the matan that starts off this whole dialectic and the set of problems that we're dealing with. Can you guys see it? I'll try to make it larger, but a little better? Somebody will have to teach me. Let me try. Do I do
Maybe highlight the paragraph and
a view, right? Should.
Yeah, on the bottom right, you can just use this.
Oh, that thing. Okay. I'm technologically challenged, so better? Yeah. All right. Okay. So this is what the Matin says. Roman numeral 1, or sorry, Arabic numeral 1. The absurd, insofar as it is absurd, has no form in the intellect, right? So al-muhal is something that, just as we're talking about the square circle and so on, it's the same category. It has no form in the intellect, so it is non-existent both mentally and obviously also extra-mentally. Given this, it is clear that the reality of everything existent in the mind exists with respect to the way things are given. This is my translation. We can debate this of the expression fi nafs al-amr, and there's a reason I do it this way. There's a whole long ongoing debate about nafs al-amr. People translate it as essentially or reality and so on. Because in the Sulam tradition, nafs al-amr can also be related to those things that the mind makes up that seem to be logical impossibilities. It cannot be things that have necessarily, it can be, but not just things that have essences, nor even things that have any reality you can point to. What it really boils down to is the Arabic expression itself, which is parsed as fi haddi dhatihi, right, within the remit or the ambit of its very given self. Now that very given self can be this table, it could be the concept man, it could even be the number 2 imagined or conceptualized as odd by me, right? So the number 2 as odd is impossible fi nafs al-amr, right? That's what the Sullam would say that. So given the very given thing, whether it is concocted or imagined or it's a real imagination or an extramental reality, by virtue of its very given self, posited as such either by the mind or by mind independently, has certain features. That's what nafs al-amr in my reading means, or at least that's what the Sullam seems to be accommodating, right? So I take that parsing of it fi haddi dhatihi very seriously. Right? It's not within the definition of itself as one colleague once translated. It's referring to the remit, right? Within the remit of its very self. Anyway, that's my, when you see the way things are given or the very given, that's fi nafs al-amr, that's what I'm doing there. Okay, going on now. So he's continuing to say, thus no judgment is passed of it, namely of the absurd. Whether it be, for example, an affirmative judgment that it is impossible or a negative judgment about its existence. This is the case except with respect to something universal, when its conceptualization is among things that are possible. Every object of judgment that is obtained in the mind is a conceptualized nature, and everything that is conceptualized exists. So the judgment about it, namely the conceptualized nature, that it is impossible, and similar judgments are not correct insofar as it is what it is. However, when this thing about which the judgment is passed is considered with a view to all or some of its individual instances that are the sources of its husul, its positive obtaining, then the judgment of impossibility, for example, is correct. So impossibility is affirmed of the conceptualized nature, and it is true because the existence of the individual instances that are the sources of its obtaining is being denied. Thus, there is no issue with respect to propositions whose predicates oppose existence, such as the participant with the creator is impossible, and the joining of two contradictories is absurd. So the argument of the author may be explained in the following terms. It's a bit packed, so let me unpack it for you. A mental object, insofar as it is a mental object, has a form in the intellect. Otherwise, it would not be a mental object. As such, then, it is not absurd, since the absurd has no form in the intellect. And as a consequence, any mental object exists as a self-same given. Next, anything of which an affirmative or negative judgment is passed must have mental or extramental existence. Now one runs into a conundrum once these principles are in place. One would concede, for example, that a proposition such as the square circle is impossible is true, even though there are no square circles either in mental or extramental existence. Al-Bihārí's solution to this wrinkle in his system is to state that the proposition is not about square circles insofar as they are absurd. Rather, the proposition is parsed to mean that there are no underlying instances by virtue of which the square circle may come to have positive mental or extramental existence. But this is not the end of the issue, as he explains further. Because that's okay, an interesting and neat reading of what that proposition really means, but it's not going to help us when we get to theological claims like the participant with the creator is impossible. Should I carry on? Are we okay at this point? Okay.
Are we okay asking questions at this point?
Whatever you guys like.
If you prefer to just keep going and we save it to the end.
No, if you don't mind.
I don't mind at all. It's I just should warn you that I already knew even if there were no questions, I would not get to the end. But at the end, I'll try to, if we run out of time, if I'm given the cue to stop, I'll just try to summarize. The devil is in the details, I always believe, and that's where we all start arguing and engaging.
So clarifications, this is what we'll do.
Yeah.
Whatever you like.
We need
Yeah.
to interject for clarification on what he's saying. Any other commentary we'll save to the end.
Okay.
Right, so
Yeah, I was just curious, going back to that original question, the two absurdities that seem to be, at least to me, at different levels, right? The square circle absurdity versus the sharik absurdity seem to be at two different levels. One of them can be conceived, and one of them seemingly cannot be conceived by the human mind.
So I'll, if you don't mind, I'll just my wife.
What I mean by, just so that I'm clear,
Yeah.
And hopefully nobody accuses me of zandaqa, is that the absurdity of God having a sharik is impossible is at least conceived, right? we actually see that in the real world, in the sense that there are polytheists. They can conceive of it, at least. While the square circle one, we cannot even conceive.
So the argument is in fact that the Sharik al-Bari, given the proper demonstration, is in fact logically impossible. So it's of the same plane as square circle. So once you follow those demonstrations, again, whether you're compelled by them or not, that's the assumption that's being drawn already.
Okay, but that one requires logical demonstration, and the other one, the square circle one, is from its very start doomed in the sense that it cannot be even conceived.
Sure.
I can't even think about it.
Right. So what they end up showing in these demonstrations is that Sharik al-Bari, you're right, it's not a badihi thing to say that it's, I can't conceive it.
Yeah.
We think we're conceiving of a Sharik al-Bari, but when you do the demonstration, you actually realize, presumably, that by virtue of itself, that concept, given the notions of necessity and unity that is tied to necessity and so on, by virtue of itself, that concept is just as logically impossible as a square circle. So then, okay, you're right, there's a discursive work that needs to be done to get to that point, but in the metaphysics, in the demonstrations, that's the work they do to show that, okay, it's the same kind of absurdity. And once you grant that, then it becomes the same kind of argument. Yeah.
Is it fair to say that one is nadari and one is badihi?
Yeah, exactly, yeah. But the outcome is the same, right? You end up with the same point that they're both mumtani bizat. And that's it. Once you get there, then it becomes the same kind. But that's a great question, and because you're right. One is nazari and one is not nazari. Absolutely. Shall we carry on? Okay. So we know what Bihārī is trying to do, but as I said, this is not the end of the issue, because Bihārī now explains further. Number 2. As for those who said that the judgment applies in reality to individual instances, well, among them is one who said that these are actually negative propositions. Yet there is no doubt that this is an arbitrary solution. Right? So one way to overcome it is to say, well, because negative propositions should not require an existential, they don't have existential import. You don't need a referent for that. So he's saying, okay, if you transform this affirmative proposition into a negative one, then we're out of the mess. And they actually invent this thing that has to be written on more. There's one article in Persian that I know of, but this is called the Salibat al-Mahmul. One way to overcome the problems of this sort is to transform them, as he's saying, affirmative propositions to negative one. And the way to try to do it, I won't elaborate on it here, is that instead of saying that the negation applies to the copula, attaching the subject and the predicate, they say that it actually attaches to the predicate. And so when you do conversion, it's the subject is being negated. It's actually a very weird solution which I'm not compelled by, so I'm not going to elaborate on it. But this is, so again, what I'm trying to say is when you run into these problems, that's when you begin to see dynamism in motion, right? They actually come up with this new idea, Salibat al-Mahmul, to overcome these problems. But anyway, they're not discussing it here, so I won't do so either. Let me carry on. So he's saying, okay, this is an arbitrary solution. It's not something we're going to hold on to. Among them is one who said that although these propositions are affirmative, they only require the conceptualization of the subject at the time of the judgment. This is the same as it is with negative propositions without any difference, meaning this is equally silly. And by the way, I have to confess, no commentary explained to me how this would be a solution, so I don't know what he means by it, to be honest. The conceptualizing it at the very moment of the judgment, I don't know how that allows you to claim that there's no existential import. But maybe there's something there. Maybe one of you can explain it if you know about it. Anyway, however, it is obvious that this is something that clashes with an a priori sense of what a proposition is, and I think it does, because it's weird sounding. And among them is one who said that the judgment applies to supposed individual instances that have been determined to exist. It is as if he states that everything that is conceptualized by means of the tag participant with the creator, and the truth of this tag is supposed for it, such a thing is impossible with respect to the way things are given, fi nafs al-amr. Yet it is not hidden from you that this position entails that the existence of the description is more than the existence of that which is described. For the impossibility said of the partner with the creator obtains with respect to the way things are given, as opposed to the individual instances which do not obtain in this way. So reflect on this. So he's saying basically, and I'm going to elaborate on more as I read down, he's basically saying that this mental supposition that if they were a participant with the creator, and if I were to suppose individual instances underlying this participant of the creator, then the existence of these individual instances is being denied with respect to the very given participant of the creator. All of that would work fine, except that your claim is stronger than that. When you say the participant with the creator is impossible, you mean that extramentally. So the subject here that is accommodating the propositional semantics is not extramental. Your claim is true extramentally, right? When we say the participant of the creator is impossible, we mean that mind independently. In the real world, there is no Sharik al-Bari. But the only way I can make this proposition work is to construct a Sharik al-Bari in my mind, but then you want the proposition to apply to it independent of my mental concoction, so it's violating principle number 2. It's a good effort to come up with a solution, but it's not parsing fully with the other commitments in the system. Yes, please.
Really quick, the translation of Euro tag, is that translation for Unwan?
Unwan, yeah.
Unwan, okay.
Yeah. Good pick. I've had debates with my students about that. That's what I do with Unwan, yes.
So that's opposed to mafhum then?
Yes, yeah. I mean, and depending on the context, it can mean other things too, so.
Sure, yeah.
Thank you. Are we okay with the issues? Okay. Okay. Once Bihārī had laid out his own position in the briefest of terms, he turned to some competing views, each one of them meant to accommodate the conundrum produced by the absurd subject terms. The common element among them is in fact something he also shares, namely that the judgment in a proposition relates to individual instances. That's all. Remember, that's principle number 1. However, the alternative authorities parse the proposition in distinct ways. The first one states that such problematic propositions are actually negative, a claim that the author considers to be arbitrary. The second authority claims to overcome the difficulty by asserting that in such cases the subject need only be conceptualized at the time of the judgment. However, Al-Bihārī points out that this runs against our sense of what a proposition is. We don't think of propositions in this fashion. Finally, the third explanation offered is that the mind conceptualizes a nature and supposes it to apply to instances that it determines to exist. The predication applies to these instances via the tag of this nature with respect to the way things are posited or given. Al-Bihārī rejects this solution by claiming that in such a case, the predicate applies to its subject instances with respect to the way things are given, whereas the subject instances are merely supposed mentally. Following this refutation, he commands the reader to reflect with the expression fatadabbar, and then he doesn't give you anything more. No further explanation is offered. The material difference in clarity between the first and second extended quotations is obvious. Whereas for the first quotation, one can only lay out in specific steps some of the critical analytical choices of the author, in the second, one gets the sense of being confronted with a fragment of each argument followed by an elusive and elusive reflection. This blind spot obscures from view a living dialectical space into which the closing expression fatadabbar now leads the commentary tradition. And this latter expression, tadabbar, is the starting point of the journey that I want to take you on. Already, an hour into the discussion. Okay. Everybody okay? We're ready to go on this journey now. These guys are going to try to solve this. All right. Okay. So the commentators inform us consistently in various commentaries that the expression fatadabbar contains a hint. Every time you run into it, almost every time, they will say fihi ishara. In pursuing it, they effectively supply a full arsenal of defense against the third alternative position that Al-Bihārī wished to dismantle. Yet the task comprises more than a simple buttressing of Al-Bihārī's claim, in that the commentators point out that the latter's argument is in fact flawed. The hint in the hypotext, which is, I use that expression by the way to mean any underlying text, because a commentary can also be a hypotext as opposed to a hypertext. So I'm simply talking about a relation of up and down. That's all I mean by it. So the hint in the hypotext, therefore, is that it has supplied a poor argument that must be jettisoned in favor of a more robust one. Here is what Mubin, this commentator, number 5, states in relation to this issue. So this is number 3. So Mubin says the following. So what I'm trying to say, and I elaborate on it further, Bihārī gives you 3 alternatives, gets rid of the first 2, then gives an explanation for a third one, seems to be somewhat committed to it, doesn't give any further explanation, and then ends by saying فَتَدَبَّرْ and moves on with his life, right? So this is, sort of a prompt. It's not just sit there and reflect. As you're going to see, he's sending you on a journey right now. The actual matin is sending you on a journey in a curated fashion. He's going to set up an ishara here and an ishara there and so on. Okay, so Mubin says the following. This is number 3. There is a hint in the expression فَتَدَبَّرْ. The hint points to the fact that what is intended by the impossibility with respect to the way things are given is not that the impossibility exists in it, meaning with respect to the way things are given. For this would entail that the description would be ontologically greater than that which is described. This is the point we were making earlier, right? So he's saying that if you take impossibility, the predicate, to apply it to this mental concoction, then the predicate would be ontologically superior, mind independent in relation to the subject, and that's violating principle number 2. Rather, what is intended by such impossibility is the positive obtaining of existence with respect to the way things are given. تحقق الوجود في نفس الأمر. For impossibility is a denial, and denial obtains only when that which is denied does not exist. Thus, it does not follow that the description has a greater ontological status than that which is described. This is what is said in one or some is ba'd of the commentaries. So reflect on this. And then he sets you up another signpost, فَتَأَمَّلْ فِيهِ, right? So, according to Mubin, the hypotext hint was meant to undo itself. Right? This is because I can go on these tangents, but one thing I'll say quickly is that the beginning of the matan, Bihārī says, "O Lord, make this matan like the sun among the stars," and so on. And the commentators take this to mean he's asking for commentaries to be written on it, right? He says, number of commentators say his wish was fulfilled because God made his text prevalent in the madaris, and his wish was fulfilled because commentaries were written on it. So it's not a readerly culture, it's a writerly culture. You're just sort of prompting you to keep speaking what I want to say. And I'm going to lead you well after my death, even hundreds of years afterwards, right? Because they have set up these signposts for you. Okay, so according to Mubin, therefore, the hypotext hint was meant to undo itself. Al-Bihārí's explicit argument was that if the predicate of impossibility applies with respect to the way things are given, and if that to which it applies is a set of mentally determined instances of which a supposed tag is mentally posited to apply, then the description of impossibility has an existence greater than the existence of the thing described. According to Mubin, the hypotext is implicitly suggesting that this outcome would violate the principle that the thing described must be equal to or greater than the description in terms of existence. This argument is followed by the command فَتَدَبَّرْ, as we saw, which ironically invites the commentator to the task of dismantling the refutation that the matin himself is presenting. Mubin points out that the hint in the expression فَتَدَبَّرْ is that impossibility is simply the denial that existence should obtain with respect to the way things are given, fi nafs al-amr. The predicate of impossibility is not meant to suggest that impossibility exists in that ontological space. Thus, the infelicitous consequence that constitutes the crux of the hypotext refutation, namely that the description would be ontologically superior to the thing described, against the opposing position does not follow. The refutation was true on interpretive grounds that the Sulam grants, but grounds that Mubin, as guided by the hint of the Sulam itself, Mubin dismisses. The hypotext therefore appears to be calling to its own redress in this moment. Yet this counter-refutation to which Mubin is led does not constitute a closure. Indeed, it would be strange if it did, given that this would mean that the hypotext, the matin, the Sulam, that the hypotext is consciously presenting an indefensible position and is not merely participating in the game that guarantees its future actualization. Thus, the dialectical process continues. In the next breath, as presented at the end of the last quotation that I just showed you, it's right up here, the counter-refutation in Mubin's commentary invites further redress with the expression فَتَأَمَّلْ فِيهِ. Reflect on this. And the command leads to a pithy statement in Al-Bihārí's self-commentary. So now he's going to go back to Al-Bihārī with this. And it is reported, the self-commentary is now being reported by Mubin here in number 4. And he says the following. Right, so this is the commentator now. So as you can, just to summarize it, right, the Matin has presented a certain explanation, and he ends with a particular command to reflect. The commentator comes along and he points out that this particular, if you actually do reflect on it, you end up undoing what the Matin is saying. And he's being led to this position by the principles the Matin himself has adopted. So the Matin is sort of inviting you to actually undo his argument, which, as I'm saying, would be a pretty bad move on any Matin's part, right? Why would you write a book and give a bad argument and know it's a bad argument and then stop right there? So Mubin then is now continuing the work that the Matin should have done, and the Matin is making him do this work. So Mubin says the following, number 4. The author stated in his self-gloss that it is not hidden from the author that to which the mind is led, ma yansaqu ilayhi dhihn, by the statement, the participant with the creator is impossible, is that the quiddity is impossible with respect to existence in an unqualified sense, mutlaqan. Not that it is impossible with respect to existence under the determination, right? So when you say the participant with the creator is impossible, Bihārī is presenting an explanation which is violating principle number 2, and furthermore, the solution that he's offering, namely that it's only a mentally determined subject term on which impossibility applies, not only is it violating the principle, it's also presenting the proposition in a fashion in which we don't think of a proposition, right? Your mind is not led to think of a proposition in this fashion when you make the claim. When you say the participant with the creator is impossible, what you really mean is that the participant with the creator extramentally is impossible. It's not just on the mental determination. It doesn't serve your theological purposes either, right? It's not the mentally concocted God that is impossible. You mean the real, participant with God that's impossible. Is everybody okay with this so far? Okay. Al-Bihārī's position therefore appears to be that the predicate of impossibility should be parsed as an unconditioned denial of the possibility of the existence of the quiddity, namely the participant with the creator, not just the quiddity insofar as it is taken to be true of supposed mental instances that are determined to exist and for which it is mentally supposed to serve as a tag. We are told in Al-Bihārī's words, as quoted by Mubin, that this is because the mind is not. So Bihārī himself in his self-commentary is saying that what I'm offering as a solution is that to which the mind is not led. That's not how we think about proposition, and certainly not this kind of claim. Right? So we are told in Bihārī's words, as quoted by Mubin, that this is because the mind is not led to the specific interpretation of the proposition that was offered by the third alternative. This position is in concert with the rejection of the third position, and in Mubin's words, it is a hint towards the author's foregoing response to the aporia. He says, هذا إشارة إلى ما سبق من المصنف في جواب الإشكال. So this ishara in Bihārī is leading the commentator to realize that what preceded the ishara is a bad argument. He goes to the self-commentary of the Matin himself, and the Matin is saying, this is not how we think of propositions, forget what I just said in my Matin. And it is also leading Mubin at this point, the Matin himself through his isharat, is leading Mubin himself to the self-commentary leading him to another part of Bihārī's Sulam to redress the problem that we have. So it appears that Bihārī is aware, the Matin is aware of the various problems out there. He's not solving them for you, he's sort of giving you little clues and hints and leading you through his own self-commentary, different parts of his text, for you to construct an argument and speak for him. Okay. If one turns to the earlier commentarial engagements with the same lemma, one discovers that the general thrust was rather similar. The details in such cases also complicate notions of authorship as well, as I'll mention going forward. The 18th century commentator Hamdullah, whom I have mentioned as, number 4 here, for example, informs us that Al-Dawani, the famous Al-Dawani, who dies in the very, very early part of the 16th century, was among the proponents of the third position that Bihārī seems to both accept and not accept. Accepting it ostensibly, but telling you there's an ishara, go back to my self-commentary, go back to other parts of my text and realize why this is not going to work, even though I seem to be saying this is a great argument, right? So he informs us that Dawani was among the proponents of the third position, explaining Al-Bihārī's objection in the following words. So now this is number 5. So this is Hamdullah, one of the commentators who is commenting on Al-Bihārī. And he says, number 5, the gist is that the judgment passed on supposed instances is imagined in 2 ways. The first is that it is judged regarding them that the predicate exists on the determination that the supposed instances obtain ala taqdir tahaqquqiha, and the determination that the tag of the subject terms is true of them. This is the considered position of the lot of the later scholars about haqiqi propositions. The second understanding is that the predicate exists with respect to the way things are given in actuality, fi nafs al-amr bil-fi'l. This is as it is understood from the discourse of one of the later scholars. If the first position is intended, then it is not hidden that it goes contrary to that to which the mind is led, khilaf ma yansaqu ilayhi dhihn, with respect to these propositions, right? So this is saying proposition number one is, again, that's not how you want to conceive of a proposition. This is so because the meaning of our statement, the participant with the creator is impossible, is that the quiddity is described by the description of impossibility in actuality with respect to the way things are given, not that it is so on the basis of some determination. If the second position is intended, then it follows that the description obtains with respect to the way things are given, and the existence of the thing described is merely supposed. Thus, the existence of the description would be more than the existence of the thing described. And this undermines the foundation of the premise that states that the existence of a thing for a thing is derivative of and follows from the existence of the thing described. Both of Hamdullah's interpretations of the refutation were considered by his hypertext, namely commentators writing on Hamdullah, to contain hints. Again, so we have a commentator who is giving you two solutions. Neither of them seems to be working properly. He seems to accept one of them, and he's dropping hints, and that's how his commentators take it. In the first case, the idea that the mind is not led to parse such propositions in the manner suggested is taken by the author of Al-Intibah, which is a commentary on Hamdullah, to be an allusion to the self-commentary of Al-Bihārī, as was noted above. And one might recall that the relevant fragment of the self-commentary itself ended with a call to reflect, fata'ammal. Thus, led via this circuitous path, from Hamdullah's allusion to Al-Bihārī's self-commentary to the command to reflect, Hamdullah's commentator now takes up the charge. We are told by this second order commentary, letter X, that the command to reflect is a hint, it's an ishara, back to what Al-Bihārī had previously stated, namely that the impossibility applies simpliciter, mutlaqan, not on the basis of any qualification. Yet Al-Bihārī's position is undercut by an imagined defender of the counter-refutation. The familiar Mujib shows up, whom the second order commentator introduces at this juncture. Indeed, it was precisely such a challenger to this position whom Al-Bihārī had envisioned in his command, fata'ammal, in the self-commentary. The argument against Al-Bihārī, as presented by Al-Intibah, the X there, is that the quiddity must be impossible on the mental determination of the existence of the instances, since Al-Bihārī holds the position that judgment applies to instances, yet the participant with the creator has no instances that obtain. In other words, in order for Al-Bihārī to be consistent in his parsing of propositions, he must accommodate instances. However, the only instances that avail themselves in the case at hand are mentally determined ones. Hence, impossibility does not apply simpliciter. Right? So our argument is that when Bihārī says the participant of the creator is impossible, he should not mean the participant of the creator insofar as it is concocted by the mind, which has no instances. Because we know principle number one, it has to apply to instances of one sort or the other. Responding now in Al-Bihārī's voice, he says faqala, even though Al-Bihārī doesn't quite say it that way, as a fulfillment of the command to reflect on this projected challenge, the Mujib who doesn't exist but he's projecting him, Al-Intibah explains that although the judgment of impossibility applies to mentally determined instances with respect to the way things are given, they are not impossible owing to the determination and supposition. And this is a nice move. He says, وَلَيْسَتْ مُمْتَنِعَةً بِحَسَبِ التَّقْدِيرِ وَالْفَرْضِ. Hamdullah's second interpretation of the refutation is likewise taken to be a hint. And we now find a marginal note on Hamdullah, and this is number 6. Right, so let me actually pause for a moment. Right, the solution that's being offered is precisely what the Sulam does throughout. He's saying that once you have posited something in the mind, even if it is something that has no instances, and even if the instances are simply imagined to exist, and even if you can't conceive it, posited as such, they become, you can talk about them with respect to the very given self, fi nafs al-amr. And therefore you can make a claim about that, about them being impossible, fi nafs al-amr, even if it's a concocted thing that is that's not conceptually possible, because you're considering them with respect to their positedness. So then they become on the same plane, right? I'm not making a claim about the impossibility of the participant with the creator in the extra-mental world. I'm not even making a claim of it insofar as it is mentally conceived. I'm simply saying, were there to be a participant with the creator and were the tag applied to its instances, then given as such, fi nafs al-amr, right, in the ambit or remit of their very given selves, impossibility on that same plane would apply to them. That's the solution being offered, right? So at least he solved problem number 2, principle number 2. He's sort of, I mean, it's not a solution that in ordinary language when we say that Sharik al-Bari Mumtane is going to be satisfied with, but at least he's able to overcome both problems, right? He's offering instances that are mentally concocted, and he's also, so that's principle number 1, and he's also saying the subject and the predicate are on the same ontological plane. Both are fi nafs al-amr in that fashion. So, okay.
Wait, can I clarify? What's your contention with this?
When we say Sharik al-Bari Mumtane, right, I mean, to put it this way, we mean this in a very real way, right? So he's saying, but we saw the problems with that at the beginning of the talk.
Yeah.
So he's saying, okay, I can solve both problems. I can say that were there to be a Sharik al-Bari, and were the term Sharik al-Bari to apply to some instances, then within the remit of this givenness, this hypothetical scenario, it would be impossible with respect to its very given self.
Right. What's wrong with that?
It works, right? It satisfies principle number 1 and number 2. What's wrong with it is that when we say Sharik al-Bari Mumtane, we mean this presumably with reference to some claim that is not a mere mental concoction, right? We mean it in a very real way. There is no Sharik al-Bari. So he's sort of, I suppose he's going to a very high level of hypothetical, mental concoction, and it works, it parses semantically, right, in the conditions that have been posited. But now we've gone so far that it's not really doing the job it's supposed to do for theology.
So is it correct then just to simply say that he's no longer treating it as a categorical proposition, but more as a hypothetical now?
Yeah.
Because it has to deal with an impossibility that it can't be a real thing. So the proposition changes.
Yeah, and then they're going to be.
That's how we can make sense of these conundrums there.
And then there are going to be these discussions. That's exactly it. There are going to be discussions about are categorical propositions reducible to hypothetical ones? Are they really the same? And so on. So that's another train in which the commentators will be led, and they'll refer back to Tahtani and Urmavi and so on to overcome this, right? Again, let me stress how exciting and fun this world is, right? I mean, these guys, they're just brilliant people, and this is what we have lost. I mean, just to pontificate for a second, and I'm preaching the crowd. I'm among colleagues who know this, so much better than me. But the point here is that this is the kind of stuff that's there. Alhamdulillah is an 18th century figure, right? Mubin is a 19th century figure. This commentary is a late 19th century commentary. It's happening. It was 100 years ago, right? So this is okay. Should we carry on? Are we okay? Are we sort of together right now? Yes, please.
As together as I can be.
Well, we can get into our commentarial space whenever we want, right now or later. Yeah.
I know there are other solutions that I've encountered to this in the same commentary literature, but in the solution that's being provided here, when you say Sharik al-Bari Mumtana', is Sharik al-Bari being understood the way Bihārī is presenting it to us here, and the way all the commentators are assuming, as, to be careful here, but like one composite concept?
Great. So he doesn't, with Sharik al-Bari, he doesn't talk about that issue. But it's going to be a cognate of Zayd exists. Because the same problem, right? If existence on a peripatetic view is something that comes to supervene on an essence, then that essence must already exist. And therefore, that claim requires an underlying referent for the tag, namely Zayd or whatever you want to say. And then the solution, I'm sort of really jumping ahead, but one of the solutions to make it all work together is to say that, well, the quiddities are the product of Jal Basit, namely the taqarrur, or the establishment of the quiddity, is its very existence. And if you accept that metaphysical or theological position, then that will parse too, and so will this one, right? So now we're being led into, theological positions to solve semantic problems of semantics.
Correct.
Yeah.
Because other solutions to the same aporia here have to deal with, it's not one concept, you're actually dealing with two separate concepts, divine entity and then the co-share, and then there's a different solution if you're starting from that point.
Yeah, exactly.
Square circle too, 'cause
Yeah.
there's two things that are.
Even a square circle can be understood as one essence, or square and circle, and then depending on your starting point, you'll come up with two different solutions.
Absolutely, and you're hinting at a position which I'm really happy about, because I say this in the book, that for Bihārī, concepts are unified. So if they can have many elements, but they are they're muttahid. They're one and the same and self same. So even if they have parts, so that's the underlying. You're right. That's the underlying conception of what concepts are. Underlying understanding of what concepts are, on which is predicated this discussion. You're right. But if you take them to be hay'a ijtima'iyya, for example, of some sort, then the kinds of solutions that will be offered and the kind of logic that will develop will be different. Exactly. So now we're very much into the thick of these issues, right? This is logic interacting with ontology and theology, and neat things are happening in the field of logic because of all those pressures. I don't know where we are. Should we keep going, or? Okay, I have the easy job. I just have to read. You guys have to because I was saying yesterday to Jihad that this is not stuff one reads or one lectures, right? Because as I mentioned, even I can't keep all those details in my head. It's something you sit down and underline and read. And so, okay, you guys are the recipients. Okay. So.
Okay, why is everybody looking at me? We should. Why don't we break? Why don't we take a break?
Sure.
Come back to it, and if you want to take us as far as you think we need to go in what you prepared, and then we can open up for more discussion, because that was
Sure.
the routine that we did. And yesterday I wasn't giving breaks. So
Sure.
is that okay?
But everything is fine with me. I'm just really enjoying this. So I can keep going. I can stop.
So let's use this